everyone for joining us again. I'm your host, BJ Gramillion, and today I have Brian Levredge with us. He is here locally, Chattanooga, and he owns and operates First Property Management, and I know you've got your hands in a lot of other things. That's just one of, I'm sure, many things that we'll be talking about. Real estate investor, and I met Brian actually, it's probably about a year ago when I was coming back and forth from Arizona, and we were thinking about moving out here, and met Brian. We had lunch together, and he's just someone that I was like, man, I need to get to know this guy a lot better, because you can just tell with some people that they've experienced a lot of things, and he's kind of seen it all. He's one of those veteran guys that has been around the block in the industry. So anyways, I was super excited to learn more about him, and he's gracious enough to say yes to come on the show today. So Brian, thanks for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me. I hope I can add some value to your listening audience.
I have no doubt that you will. Brian, also, you have a podcast as well, and I want to let everyone know about it. What's it called again?
It's the Old Fashioned Real Estate Show. You can find us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and other places. But yeah, if you just search Old Fashioned Real Estate, you should be able to find us pretty quickly.
Awesome. So, and you do that with Jeff Holst, right?
Yeah, my partner Jeffrey Holst and I, we've been doing it about 5 years now. So we drink bourbon and opine on various real estate topics. Sometimes you can tell that we film multiple episodes at the same time because
yeah,
the English gets a little sloppy after 3 or 4 episodes.
That's awesome. These guys know how to have a good time, and you know what? They've learned a thing or two with investing, and we were joking about this before the show. I was like, you know what? I really enjoy this podcast because I don't necessarily want to talk about everyone's, victories and their short clips of like, hey, look at all the cool things that I've done. I actually enjoy more than anything learning about the journey. I love learning about all the ugly stuff that happens behind the scenes that no one gets to actually, see what goes on. But every successful entrepreneur and especially real estate investor that I talk to, the more you talk to them, they all have just incredible stories. And I love to learn about, hey man, this wasn't clean by any means how I got to where I am now. There were a lot of missteps throughout the process. And so that's what I love to focus on. And I think people enjoy hearing about other people's, failures that, hopefully turn into success. Sometimes not always. And so anyways, I wanted to, kind of dive into that a little bit more. You are mainly in multifamily, correct? Like not so much single family anymore. Is that right?
Correct. I like most everybody else started doing single family while ago, and my path was buying low income single family houses right during the last recession, right? So didn't know what a great buying opportunity that was at the time, and I'm sure like everybody else I wished I had bought more, of course, right? So but I always wanted to get into multifamily, to your point, and was able to start doing that about 8 years ago. Bought our first 6-unit building here in the Chattanooga, Tennessee area. Bought a 27-unit a couple of years after that, and then just have acquired apartments pretty much every along the way ever since that point in time. And then we have also dabbled in different commercial assets like suburban office, industrial flex. Had retail at one point in time. Actually, I sold that to Jeff. So it's been fun. But yeah, primarily we stick with apartments.
Okay. So I'm curious. I'm sure that there were some reasons that led you to discover multifamily and why you wanted to get out of the single family industry. So what are some of those experiences that you had that just told you, hey, look, we're going the wrong direction here?
There's no, this is a philosophical thing that comes down to personal preference in my case, right? I think we'd both agree there's no right or wrong answer here.
Right.
People, in fact, friends of mine here, yourself, I mean, you've done very well with single family and so forth. So, but for me, I before I moved out here, I worked for a property management company out west. And in addition to managing one of their buildings, I was also a contractor that renovated both the interiors and the exteriors of the new acquisitions, shortly after they bought them, and helped in the repositioning process for them and their investors. And so you just got to see this really powerful force at work where, they come in and, the old adage, buy low, except they never sold, right? They just keep. And in fact, in some instances, they'd owned stuff so long that the depreciation schedules had completely run their course, right? And so,
Wow.
which is, 29 and a half years on residential. So I was like, and you can refinance these things every 5 years, or, depending on what your IRR you want that to look like, etc. And it's just, you get some economies of scale that I don't believe you necessarily get with single family, because believe it or not, I used to think, well, if I've got 30 doors of single family, that's just the same as having a 30-unit apartment building. And then I started doing my own maintenance, and I learned, no, in fact, it's not. And so, and by doing my own maintenance, I mean, I have my subs and stuff. I'm not handy enough to, go change out a toilet and stuff like that. But all that's to say, it was time consuming. So having a concentration of your renters at a single location, a single roof, or maybe just a couple of roofs versus, 30 of them, just means you're dealing with less generally. So for me, in a financing perspective, I think this is kind of an important point too, is that with multifamily, it's typically viewed by most lenders as about the stablest asset class there is within real estate. And so those properties are a function of their net operating income. So we can all rent houses, right? But single family housing values are typically tied more to comp sales. So that can fluctuate. So forces that are generally beyond our control can impact the value of our assets. With apartments, I think we have a greater control over that. And that's really what it boils down to for me.
Yeah. And I have nothing that I disagree with there. And it's interesting. I've been thinking a lot about this lately and would love to get your take on this. So, AI is obviously on everyone's mind, and it's a big concern. With a lot of people, like, what's going to happen, and I think it's happening much faster.
That's what's going to happen. Right?
What's that?
Skynet, right? The Terminator.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, who knows, man? I mean, you hear all these theories. Everyone's kind of freaking out, like, what's going to happen? I think that Chat GPT, that rolling out in 2023, I think that really opened up everyone's eyes. Like, oh shoot, it's here. Like that happened, I think, a lot faster, and I think it just became more real to everyone, because now everyone's starting to kind of play with it and be like, whoa, this is crazy. So there's AI, and then I feel like every marketplace, typically over time, you look at it, it becomes more efficient, and then of course big businesses basically come in, take over. Wall Street eventually just eats it up, and then it consolidates into a handful of people that own all the wealth, and that's just kind of how it works in the free market. So I look at single family homes, and I've actually just kind of come to this realization, like Jeff Bezos, for example, has opened up a fund that he, I think he put 125 million into it. Have you heard about this?
No, but I've seen, like, Colony Capital and is it BlackRock? They all have funds to buy and own, single family portfolios in the major metros.
Exactly. I think a lot of them have obviously got into the game. Now, his idea was essentially they're trying to make it so it's like Wall Street, where you can buy shares of homes. So you, with $100, instead of needing 20% down, you can put $100 like into a share, basically, and own, and essentially trade it similar to Wall Street. So he's kind of the first that I've seen that's made an attempt to do something like that at a large scale. There's others that have tried to do it, but of course he gets involved, and there's a good chance it could happen and be successful. But But when I look at single family homes, I feel like the biggest barrier to AI taking over Wall Street and all that is what you just alluded to with like just the repair side. Every single home is so unique and different that it's just not, it's such a difficult thing to do at scale and to be able to kind of like an assembly line where you think about they control everything from start to finish. Well, we all know single families are just their own beasts, and every property was built by someone else, and you don't know if the electrical or plumbing was done right, and there's so many intricacies that I feel like that's almost like a barrier of protection, like a moat around AI and being able to have these large hedge funds come in. And I know they're trying. I know that that's their goal because they see the returns are just second to none. You can't. I mean, they're just salivating. But I feel like it's so difficult for them to be able to penetrate for that reason in the single family industry as opposed to multifamily. So I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts on that?
I agree with you. I remember when, I guess this is about 10, 12 years ago, whenever I started reading about the hedge funds going and buying, and Phoenix, I think, was a popular market where they started doing this initially, and Atlanta,
that was always ground zero. Yeah
and so to your point, I think investors who are local will always have a leg up over people that are trying to run this business remotely from a faraway place, using whatever technology they can get their hands on to make things both cheaper and more efficient for them. But at the end of the day, if you look back, their model sort of broke down some because they were buying so much stuff, right, that they couldn't possibly digest it in a realistic time frame. So you had these houses that were sitting, and now everybody looks like a genius because they've got the benefit of 10 years behind them. Well, rising market, as a tide lifts all boats, etc. So but those first few years, the returns were probably non-existent on that because of that backlog and so forth. And so so today, and you see the institutional investors are trying to do the same thing with C-class multifamily, which is where we primarily do most of our deal volume and transaction volume as well, right? So we're typically buying old depreciated buildings, breathing new life into them, and creating a nice experience for what are typically working class residents that we rent to. And we do so at a fraction of the price that it would cost to create that product from scratch, having bought the land and developed or redeveloped for that matter. And so I think, that local knowledge will always give those of us that are in those markets a leg up over those, over the big money. I mean, one day they might figure it out and eat all our lunch, and that probably will happen. And hopefully it's after I'm gone, but we'll see.
Yeah. And I could not agree more. I just look at maybe single family as being okay. I know that it's a lot harder. So there's pros and cons. Like, it is much more difficult to scale. And I think it's incredibly difficult. Like, we're trying to figure out, just because we have a turnkey business model where we're trying to go in and remodel homes, right? And then you realize quickly, okay, this crew can only handle 2 or 3 projects at a time. And then it just starts going backwards. Like, stuff starts to fall through the cracks. And so then you got to go find other crews, but you got to train them. And then there's all this, slippage, and where's your materials going, and are they taking them or are they leaving? Like, you got an inventory, and there's so many things that I feel like, because it's not a controlled environment, it's a very difficult market to master when it comes to scale. And so
100%. And I'm from Los Angeles originally, right, which is a giant spread out metro area. And so think about that. You can't have a single property management company handle your whole portfolio if it's spread out over a big region. It would, for the same reasons you just cite with rehab, it would break down. You can't be, your people can't be everywhere. And LA traffic being what it is, for instance, it might take you 4 hours to get to the other side of town, right? Well, you've just lost a day, right?
Yep.
To deal with maybe one house or a couple or something. So then of course, rental demand fluctuates based on area and schools and things of that nature. And so it's really hard and I think this is why, like, I don't mean to go off on a tangent here, but it was like Redfin and Open Door and Zillow all attempted to sort of, hey, we'll just buy, right? We're going to buy your house using an algorithm. Well, how well has that worked out? So
Yeah, look at their stock prices. Not too well.
yeah.
I know someone in Arizona that worked for Open Door actually, and she actually was in their accounting department. And obviously, without sharing the details, she was like, just so you know, every single home it was red, and it wasn't like small. It
It's like
was like
20 grand a door.
$60,000
Yeah, it's
losses.
like,
Yeah, down the board, like just
yeah.
one after another. And I'm like, whoa. But we saw it. We're like, oh yeah, like I have no doubt that that was accurate. Maybe she was embellishing a little bit, but yeah, I mean, it's just something difficult. So anyways, so that actually goes into what I'd love to actually ask you, because how long have you owned First Property Management for?
It is going on 9 years old at this point. So we
Okay,
started it back at the very beginning of 2015.
that's awesome. And how many doors do you guys have now, roughly?
We're like 1,000 units under management here locally.
So awesome. And that's, you guys are the largest, right? Or
I
no?
don't. I don't know. There's a couple. I would say we're probably one of the largest non-captive owned companies, meaning we're not controlled by institutional investors that are, self-managing their own assets.
Yeah.
I know there's
Yeah.
a few of those guys around town too. So
Man, that's awesome. Okay, so with that, I'm sure you've got some interesting stories. I love hearing about property management stories because they're the ones that hear all the craziest stuff that happens that you just wouldn't believe actually happens unless you are actually there, right? And so I'm curious on the property management side of things, what are some crazy experiences that you've had in the property management space with tenants?
oh boy. So we've had Murphy's Law is a very real thing. Let me first state that, right? If it can go wrong, it will. It may
Yeah.
not be today or tomorrow, but it's just a matter of time. Especially, and this is true for all of us, not just property managers. You buy enough doors, and you're dealing with the human condition, which, of course, if you want to be successful, you're going to have to do because people need housing and they're willing to pay for that.
Hmm.
And you see things that you frankly can't unsee, and so there's some of the more whimsical ones to some of the more downright just awful situations. So I mean, I can give you a couple examples of each, right? I
I
mean,
would love it.
we so my partner Jeff and I, we bought an apartment building a couple years ago, and we closed it on a Friday late in the day and got the keys, which I dropped off at the management company. But really, we'd gotten the leases. The thing may have just been set up in the software at this point. And I'm out with friends now. It's happy hour, and I get a phone call from Jeff who says, "Hey, the old owner is trying to get a hold of you or me because there's a girl who's trying to get a hold of her brother. She says he lives in apartment whatever, and she's worried about him, and he's diabetic." And it's like, okay, well, this woman's nowhere on the lease. I can't just show up and let her in. And so we say, look, if you're concerned for his well-being, call the fire department and have them force entry, and we'll just deal with the rest, which is what she does. And then about, I don't know, 30, 45 minutes later, I get a call. It's the police. And her brother, unfortunately, had passed away in the apartment and was already starting to decompose, right? That process had set in
Wow.
into the floor a little bit. So, yeah.
Wow.
and you're just like, and it's awful because here, somebody's lost a family member, of course, right? And that's where your concern is as a human first, is other people's well being, and then
Right.
the next thing you go is like, this is going to be a little bit of a doozy. And that's not even the worst one, right? So we took over in a management of an apartment building, which we were in the process of buying from the seller, but his old management company didn't want to continue on, and so we inherited this property where we placed literally none of the residents at the time, and in the first 4 months, we evicted a third of the tenants. It was a 42 unit apartment building. So, we got rid of like 13 people, or 13
Yeah.
units. We had 3 deaths in the first 90 days on site. 2 were of natural causes and 1 was an overdose. The one of the natural causes one was they had been in the unit deceased in the summer. The air was not running, and so without trying to be too graphic, bodies, when they get to that state, right, gas buildup inside the body, and then the body pops and literally explodes all over the inside of the apartment.
What?
So the coroner, yeah, I hope nobody's working on it.
What? I did not know this.
You gotta get a hazmat, like a Service Master or Serv Pro type, remediation company to come in and clean it up before we'll release the unit back to you. Okay. So we get that quote. It's like $4,000 or $5,000. Send it to the owner, and he's like, "Hell no, I'm not doing that. Like, I'm just gonna have a handyman go in there, and we'll just clean it up." And you're like, "That's like no, like that's awful." And
who's gonna go in there and clean it up?
Yeah. Well, he actually sent somebody without telling us, and that's exactly what he did. We still had it remediated after we closed on it. So
he sent someone to go in and clean up a dead body. Just some
the remnants of it, right? The coroner had taken out, I guess, most of them left at that point, right?
Oh, that's horrible.
But there was stuff on the walls and the ceilings.
Oh my gosh! So you explode, like if you're not like properly taken care of when you pass, gas builds up and you explode
just like a balloon. Yeah.
Oh my gosh!
So
that's the craziest thing I've ever heard.
So that's the grosser side. On the more.
Do you have to disclose that in Chattanooga? Like, is that like a law?
Either Tennessee or Georgia requires a death in a house or a rental unit to be disclosed.
It doesn't, or it does?
It does not. No.
It does not. Okay. So you didn't have to mention to the next person, "Hey, guess what? Someone exploded."
Yeah. Oh, by the way, we'll give you
all over the walls.
off on this one, right?
Oh my gosh, can you imagine like moving in after that, someone didn't properly clean it, and you're like, "What's that on the ceiling? Like it looks like
we put bubble gum up here or something?" No, that's tissue.
Wow, that's wild. Did the neighbors know about it? Did they find out? Were they like, did they smell it?
Yeah, I mean, so that's sort of what led to it. Was we got reports from 1 or 2 of the neighbors about, "Hey, it smells really bad, like old garbage or something, and we haven't seen this person. Can you, go look?" And we did, and we're like, "Okay, I think a maintenance guy went, and we knocked and opened the door and immediately shut it back up, and the next phone call was to 911.
Oh,
yeah,
poor guy. I don't want to be that guy.
Elderly gentleman. I don't know that he had much family or anything like that. I don't know a whole lot of what happened in the aftermath that was related, to that, and not necessarily getting the apartment back into.
Man, that is so crazy. Okay, so question on that actually. So, and because I've never experienced death in one of our units before that we've managed or that I've owned. And so when that occurs, let's say that they didn't pay the rent for that month. How are you collecting that? What's going on there?
Well, to be clear, most state laws, the way they're written, when somebody dies, that's an immediate termination of the lease agreement, right?
Okay, good. So you were let out of the lease. You were okay there.
Give you notice, obviously, not to
Yeah.
yeah.
Now, how do you collect payment though? Like, what if they
Well,
haven't paid?
if they haven't paid, so I mean, we've unfortunately dealt with this a couple times over the years where there are family members involved, and we've had people get into car accidents and not survive that, and we find out via family, and then the family asks for some time to go through the belongings and sort it out and stuff like
Mm,
that. Like, hey, sure. And because again, I think you can, if you want. I mean, legally, you're entitled to um, not monetary damage, but you're entitled to what you're owed, right? If they're still
yeah.
in possession of the unit. I try to, as a rule of thumb, give people a couple weeks. Just, hey, look, it's a traumatic time for you, and if you're the guy that's going, hey, where's my money?
You imagine being that guy.
No, it's just not who I am personally, and it's not how we
Yeah,
handle
don't imagine you doing that.
it. And so, but yeah,
Oh, that's
you also have a deposit, right? Typically, which you can
yeah.
make deductions from on rent prorations if you want to do that.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. So maybe you just take that and call it.
We had people one time that we took over an apartment building, and just sort of a funny. I mean, not funny what happened, but when we were doing inspections as part of the buyer's due diligence,
Yeah.
I'd go in, I'd take pictures, I'd make some notes of each unit, and she was a cat lady, and she'd been living there for
Oh.
37 years at this point, and
Oh no.
it smelled like it, and I remember, so open the door, take 2 steps in, the ammonia overwhelms you, and I
Oh, yeah.
thrown up in my mouth and swallowed it, and so
Yep.
put a note on cats, etc. Well, she ended up getting into a car wreck the first weekend we were managing the property, and she passed away in the wreck. And the
Oh.
family reached out to us and said, "Hey, there's a lot of sentimental stuff in there. Do you mind if we just pay the rent, and then just give us time to go through things?" Yeah, sure, not. Go right ahead. Well, 9 months later, they were still paying the rent and kind of fighting over the belongings, which it's like a scratched up, uh, like Barca Lounger type thing, right? That smelled, as you can imagine, not very great. And you're just
Oh.
going like, oh my gosh, like I would have. And in some, I mean, hey, they did us a solid because all that stuff would have gone. The alternative was we go get a 30-yard dumpster and throw it all away after like storing it for 30 days, which is what the law requires. And then we would have renovated. So it kind of saved the owner in this case. So sometimes the ball bounces your way, but not, in those
Yeah.
situations, usually not at all.
Yeah. Oh man. The other thing, speaking of death, that I did not know, I was listening to a podcast with Theo Vaughn, and he had on a coroner, and the coroner that he interviewed mentioned this, and I did not know this until this podcast, but he said that the minute you die, he's like, I guess cats, if you have cats, they will start eating you, like
Oh, too,
just
I think.
picking away at you. The minute you die, he's like, he doesn't matter how nice you've been to that cat, doesn't matter what kind of owner you were. The minute you pass away, they're going after you. Like they're just gonna start nibbling. And I was like, "Are you?" I mean, I already hated cats before
Yeah,
this. Then I heard that, I'm like, "See,
exactly.
like
As
they're evil."
I'm a dog guy personally, so
Yeah,
I don't need additional reasons to dislike felines. But thank you for giving me yet.
yeah.
Yeah,
Just throwing it out there. We're all learning something here about death. You never know where this is gonna go.
yeah.
But so I'm curious because you mentioned that with maintenance specifically that it's a lot easier to own multifamily versus single family homes. So um, in your experience, like what um, with with the maintenance side of things, like was there a turning point for you, I guess, when you were doing all these single family homes? Let's say you had a handful of single family homes and you just got to a point where you're like, man, I am so tired of having to send these guys everywhere. and it just clicked where you're like, hey, the multifamily, it's so much easier to manage as a property management company.
It was, well, it was a couple. There was a couple things that happened. In full disclosure, part of the reason I started a property management company was because I'd become so frustrated with the one that was managing my portfolio at the time. And of course, when I looked around the landscape in Chattanooga at that juncture, everybody was kind of the same business model, etc. And I think, you're always going to have maintenance, right? I mean, because again, you're renting to people. I mean, so even if you camera the line, when you buy, before you buy the property, which we do, and I would also highly recommend. That's one that people, you already know, I'm sure people overlook
Amen.
that
Yes,
the
always
time.
do it.
And but then, so we'll usually even like have stuff snaked or jetted just to make sure, hey, these things are good, right? And
Yep.
then we hand you the keys. Well, sometimes you'll get somebody whose kid puts a whole roll of toilet paper down, or in some instances they flush the TV remote down the toilet too. I'm still not exactly sure how those fit because this was before Roku, but but yeah, it's, so you're gonna have stuff happen, right? It doesn't matter that you renovate to a certain standard, which is what we do. When we go in, we kind of evaluate everything, and you're like, look, if I'm going to spend, $15,000, like I might as well do it once and do it right. And so we'll change out the water heater if it's more than a few years old. You're not necessarily going to go do the same on the HVAC, but we get it serviced and things like that. But then, kitchens are refinished or replaced, granite, stainless appliances, etc. So you just, but again, coming back to it, like people say the air doesn't work. It's not, cooling enough, and it's, 100 degrees outside, and they've got the thermostat set to 61, and you're like, well, that's not quite how this works, right? So,
yeah.
But with apartments, I think what it boils down to, and I guess there's not a big distinction. Like when you own a bunch of houses and you've got one vacant house out of 30, and you've got one vacant unit out of in a 30 unit apartment building, your occupancy is the same, right? So in that sense, they offset each other. But for me, it was just like, again, you can have a lot more doors and a lot fewer locations, right? Without having to go all over town, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you're fortunate enough, we still do duplexes and small multis and stuff, but we'll typically fix them up, rent them, and then, sell them off kind of turnkey to investors too. But yeah, generally we don't, I just like to have the apartments because again, it's a single location, I think. And you're just
it makes perfect sense. Yeah, I know what you're saying. Now, something that I've been meaning to ask you, it's funny, I went to a meetup that you and Jeff were at, and you guys were the speakers, enjoyed it, had a good time. And one of the things that you mentioned in there was you thought that interest rates were going to potentially go up, if I remember correctly, in 2024. So after the events of last week, do you stand by that statement, or are you adjusting?
I think I was saying that at that meeting. I was like, I used to think, and I've changed my mind on this a couple times. So of course I'm going to reserve the right to do so again.
Yeah.
I don't know. My crystal ball is not that good. I used to think rates would come down second half of the year. That's, you read around and you see things. And then of course, to your point,
I did too.
The Fed signaled, well, we'll probably drop them, 3 times next year, which would of course undermine my position of them staying, kind of where they're at.
Yeah.
And, it just boils down to the state of the economy and inflation, so if inflation stays high, are we going to start trying to like lower rates to juice employment, for instance? You end up in this sort of rock in a hard place, from a monetary policy, which, that's a whole other interview and conversation, but so I don't know. I tend to think it probably won't move that much. But certainly, I mean, if they're saying they're going to drop them 3 times next year, I'd probably take them face value until they say otherwise, right? So,
Right.
but
Right.
again, what's that even going to mean for the rest of us? Who knows, right?
No, it's true. And I know we all like to have this game of guessing, but I mean, that's what it is. It's funny how literally every single economist was wrong last year with their prediction of the market going into recession 2023. I mean, everyone. I don't think there was a single person that did not come out and say
Yeah.
we were going to go into a recession.
I've been hearing recession since 2017, right?
Right.
And,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
eventually they'll be right. I mean, I
Yeah.
guess I should go be
Yeah.
an economist because it seems like you just got to come up with a position and stick to it, and eventually you're going to be right. And if you're well known enough, you'll sell a lot of books and get to go to speaking engagements.
That's it. I mean, I think fear clearly sells. And yeah, I had someone bring it up the other day, and I hadn't thought about this. I was at an event, a mastermind group that I'm in, and the speaker mentioned, he's like, look, the problem right now with, among a lot of other things, he's like, one of the problems is we really only have one lever to pull right now. In the past, there was both fiscal and monetary levers that could be pulled. But because Congress is such a joke and because they are so gridlocked and cannot do anything, they're just completely useless at this point. They're just wasting air. Because our government is so inept at doing anything these days other than spending money and going into debt, he's like, we no longer have that lever to pull. So really the only lever you can pull is on the monetary side. So now it's funny, I don't remember hanging on every word that Jerome Powell would come out and say, but now I find myself every day wondering, hey, did Jerome Powell say anything today? Like, because it literally has the ability to just massively change this market just in a couple sentences. It's just wild.
100%. I mean, what a gig. But
Yeah.
if those guys, the Fed, right, they raise and lower the overnight Fed funds rate, which when banks borrow from each other, that's basically the rate that they pay, or when they borrow from the Fed, really. So but that doesn't really dictate mortgage rates so much, right? I mean, if you're talking about construction loans, yeah, most construction loans are based off of the prime rate.
Yeah.
But most other mortgage rates are based on the 10-year, and you'll typically see a yield or a spread of about 175 to maybe 225 basis points above the 10-year, which has actually moved down about a half a point in the last month or something like that.
Yep.
There's a little bit of relief there, and they can certainly, the other thing they can do, I think, to what you're highlighting is they can do QE, right, which they've done in the past, which they just go on this massive bond buying, spree to artificially lower rates, which is what we had, for the last however many years, and then they said they were going to stop, but I think stopping really just meant, well, we're not going to buy quite as much as we've been buying in the past, right? But we're still buying $100 billion a month or something insane.
It is. Yeah. At this point, it's just, beyond comprehension. They're just like, whatever. No one's paying attention anymore. We're just printing like crazy.
But I mean, I think it would behoove all of us as investors to probably I think focusing on the interest rate is the wrong place to look when you're evaluating a deal, certainly.
Agreed.
Now, the math has to work. Let's be clear about that. But I think if the math works, you really like the asset, maybe the math doesn't have to work as good as it did, 5 years ago when it was a lot easier.
Yeah.
And so you might say, well, I think this thing's going to do really well. Maybe I got to put a little bit more down, which is going to dilute my ROI, et cetera, because of the interest rate environment we're in. But maybe in a couple of years' time, we can, if rates come down, we can take advantage of that and we can refinance, pull some money back out, et cetera, and go lather, rinse, and repeat. I mean, it's just part of the cycle of business, right? And so the people that are going, well, I'm not going to buy, I'm waiting for rates to come down. You could be waiting a really long time, and you can miss, and you will miss a lot of opportunity.
Yeah.
Which is fine, because I think guys like us know better than that, and it just means less competition. So.
Yep, which we're all for. Did not enjoy 2021. It was nice when I was selling, but man, that was a tough time to be buying.
Yeah.
Man, this has been awesome. So one of the things that I like to ask at the end of a podcast, there's a couple questions I like to ask, but one of them is, okay, if you could go back to the beginning of your real estate career in investing, knowing what you know now, what is something that you would do differently with the knowledge that you have now?
Oh boy, this is like going back to college.
Yeah, right.
Um, I wow, I'd be more disciplined. I would say I would have started syndicating earlier. I've always been a big fan of partnerships. Almost everything I've done is in some form of partnership, and a syndication is basically just a partnership with more investors in it, really.
Yeah.
At a higher level.
Mm-hmm.
And we would have hung on to stuff, and I would have sold fewer properties.
I love that you just said that. I literally just did a post on LinkedIn, and I said, every time I ask this question to real estate investors that have been doing this for a while now, for over a decade, without fail, I would say 9 out of 10 times they have that response. I would have held, I would have been more disciplined. I wouldn't have had shiny object syndrome. I would have held if I could have just done that,
Yeah.
And it's like, that's what makes us, I guess, real estate investors is we all, it's like in us, we have to have this whole shiny object syndrome, right? Where we're just bouncing everywhere and trying to because we're deal makers, and we just, it's like crack to us.
When you're younger, right? You want to be aggressive, and I would say probably the biggest. I don't mean to jump into a different direction here. Probably the biggest mistake I made was buying too much and spreading myself too thin at differing times. Okay?
Interesting.
And
what do you mean by that?
Well, to your point, right? Like with resources, and I'm not talking about capital. I'm just talking about human resources in the sense of like manpower, labor, etc. We're from a property management perspective, you can really only be as effective as the labor crews you have that undertake renovations on your behalf for your clients and so forth. Mm-hmm. And certainly our guys aren't the only ones capable of doing the work, but they're the ones we trust. And so when you're doing this on your own dime for your own account, again, they can only be in so many places doing so many things at once. So one of the silver linings to 2023 has been we bought so much stuff the few years before that in multifamily and commercial that we've now got almost all of it stabilized, right? And so we don't have units sitting waiting for guys to get to them, we can just jump on stuff and get it done, get it re-rented, increase the gross, etc. But yeah, looking back at times, I mean, it was more a situation where you're like, hey, I'm flipping 6 houses and I'm building a couple more specs and I got a lot of money out right now. And maybe something's not selling as quick as I thought it would be. And you're like, okay, it's starting to get a little tight, around the collar now. And it worked out, I mean, we have to take risk, right? But you want to be smart about the kinds of risk you take. And I think if you cannot necessarily intentionally put yourself into situations like that, maybe be a little less greedy, if I can use such a term, or just smarter about it, right? Like, maybe you partner with another, like a GC or something, and you give up a little bit more on a particular deal you wouldn't have otherwise, but it gets done faster. And now, you know what I mean? Like, there's always lessons to take away at all stages. But those would be the two biggest things. Was probably definitely not selling, because it restarts that compounding clock, and that thing, once it gets going, is very powerful. But once it stops, it's like a ship, right? It's like an ocean liner. It takes a while to get a head of steam on it, and once it's going, it's really hard to kind of slow down and stop. But then once it is, it doesn't just go 0 to 60 like a Porsche.
So, yeah, man. Yeah, and it's one of those things. It's like, I wish that, anyone listening, the hope in having shows like this and podcasts and all the content is I feel like maybe, I don't know, we didn't have podcasts, growing up, those kind of things. We didn't have all those resources. So hopefully the next generation of investors can listen to this, because I'm telling you, like, listen to history. It will repeat, like, and hopefully learn from guys like us that have been doing it for a while, and realize, like, hey, like, there's a guy that does that one rental at a time. He has the podcast and the company. It's called One Rental at a Time. And I love the concept of just, man, stack, just do one a year. If you did one a year since 2008, for example, you're done. You really could, if you recycled some of that cash and equity and all those kind of things, you could, potentially retire. And that's just on a short period of time. That's over just, think about it, 15 years. You could have a stack of cash, but nothing sexy, nothing exciting. You didn't do anything else other than just, put away enough money to buy one at a time, and with you, it's multifamily. So that compound effect is going to be just, the multiplier is pretty cool.
Oh yeah. It'll, in the next few years, we've refinanced some stuff this year, believe it or not. We got out of rates that were in the 3.5% range, and took on 6 1/8 the 25-year amortization, but we did cash outs, right? Because and they're stable assets. We put them on cruise control at this point. So and that's the purpose. It's like, well, we can wait for rates to come down, like we were discussing earlier. We could be waiting for a while, and it's like, well, the deal still works pretty well. And in fact, we had one of our loans on one of the buildings we refied was an ARM, and it was going to readjust in the present interest rate environment anyway. So the decision became pretty easy. You're just like, all right, we'll do that. And it developed a relationship with a life insurance company lender that, we had not previously had. And now they're looking at doing a bunch of other properties too. So it's good. Going to be a good thing long term. So, and I think that's the view we all need to take is, and I say this with the luxury of time and having done this for a while, and maybe it should be one of the bigger takeaways for your audience, at least from my perspective, is like, what we do isn't rocket science. You just have to kind of stay out of your own way emotionally on things at times, like don't make a knee-jerk reaction to sell because you had one bad experience with a tenant or something like that, or anything, or even a bad year on maybe your maintenance or something like that. Like it all evens out in the long run. And as long as you're well capitalized and you're not over leveraged, you're gonna be fine. And that's just it. And so if you can do those things, then it's really going to become your friend, real estate is. And it's just, it's going to take care of you in the long run, so long as you keep taking care of it. So.
Yeah. Such good advice, man. This has been fun, Brian. I knew it would be. Grateful that you took some time out of your busy schedule.
Enjoyed it. Happy to do it. Thank you.
Oh man, this is my favorite part of the week. I always save it for Fridays. Want to end on a good note, talking with people that I really enjoy being around. So thanks for coming on the show, Brian. Appreciate it.
You got it, sir. Have a great day.
All right, you too.